Thank you so much for joining us, Judge Jarmon. We're so honored to have you. Thank you.
Good morning. Now, I want to warn you, if you have been or you know someone who has been a victim or a survivor of violence, parts of what I share may be triggering. Do I have your permission to storytell? They told me when the call was made from the hospital to inform him that I had been born, my father's response was, "So what?" And he hung up the phone. I was born in Macon, Georgia. I was born into a home of violence. My birth mother suffered years of abuse at the hands of my father. Broken bones, bruises on her face and arms, threats with the use of a firearm. Perhaps because of the abuse she suffered, my mother inflicted the same upon me and her other children. We've come to understand that untreated trauma begets trauma often. We conceptualize this as generational trauma. So as a child, I was severely beaten and emotionally abused. My mother would withhold food, isolate me from my siblings, and on one occasion, she attempted to drown me in a tub. While she was never given any mental health diagnosis, I've wondered if she indeed had untreated mental health conditions. The research suggests that there's a connection between physical abuse and mental health. So my birth mother was hurt physically and likely mentally. And now imagine that being compounded with the dilemma of knowing where to get help. She did not have access to legal resources. There was no one to tell her about protection orders. She did not have someone to help her understand custody rights, the possibility of spousal and child support. She did not have the information that could have given her confidence that she and her children could actually survive, independent of my father, so that she could leave those abusive circumstances. She didn't have a civil Gideon. There's no case that told her, you are facing issues of such consequence to your rights to life, liberty, and dignity that the law requires an attorney assist you. When my mother finally left my father, she came to Washington State. So if you look at a map, Georgia, Washington, makes sense, right? When we study survivors of domestic violence, we learn that many are forced to sever all ties in order to escape. Speaking to this, Kathy Reed, when she was the executive director of the Family Abuse Center in Texas, she said, sometimes they escape with nothing, no driver's license, birth certificates, marriage licenses, immunization records, social security cards. They walk away from their cars, their health insurance, family pictures, their beloved pets and animals. Sometimes they are just glad to be alive with nothing. And I add to this, sometimes they have to leave behind their children. My mother had to leave us behind. Victims so often leave without access to legal guidance that could help them secure housing, financial assistance, employment, or custody of their children, which is everything else they are also worried about in the middle of fearing for their lives. Yet there being no civil Gideon, no legal case that says you are facing issues of such consequence to your rights to life, liberty, and dignity that the law requires an attorney to assist you. Civil legal aid is not a luxury. Safety or continued victimization, homelessness or stability, despair or hope, save myself or leave my children. These are the tragic dichotomies. So, within that tragic dichotomy, she left, and she left her children. But unfortunately, like many survivors, she left one abusive situation only to become involved with another. This new partner struggled with substance abuse and became violent when he drank. The World Health Organization once estimated that roughly 55% of domestic abuse perpetrators were drinking alcohol prior to their assaults. Now, in addition to his drinking, my mother's new partner was also a predator. At 13 years old, I didn't know the word pedophile, so I did not have the language to describe the behavior of a grown man who wanted to touch a child. I simply knew he was unsafe. But to her, I think he presented as safe. After all, he gave her financial stability. He gave her housing stability. He helped her to get her children from Georgia to Washington. And yeah, well, he beat her, but it wasn't as severe. So sadly, by her dysfunctional logic, his touching within certain limits wasn't too harmful. But slowly, what initially presented as safe to her, she came to understand was harmful. It was abusive, just in a different form. But by then, she couldn't leave. She had nothing of her own. It was all in his name. Yet there be no civil Gideon, no case law that stood for the principle that she was facing issues of such consequence to her right to life, dignity, and safety that the law was required to give an attorney. So no one there to explain her options, no one there to tell her that she would not have to stand alone in court. So we continued to stay. Knowing that it wasn't safe for me to be there, without words, my mother and I developed this routine. After school, I would hang out mostly at the SeaCac airport until around 12 midnight. And then I'd call to ask her, is it safe for me to come home yet? One night I came home too soon. My mother hurried me into a back room and whispered, "Be quiet until he leaves." From behind the closed doors, I could hear the yelling, the slaps, the banging. I heard his son, who was around the same age, come in and he yelled, "Take your ass to the room." His son came into the room and we sat crisscross applesauce. We were quiet and scared. The next moment, he came into the room with a gun in his hand. He closed the door. He turned off the lights. I remember hearing a clicking noise of the gun being cocked. We were frozen in fear, and it seemed like forever. We sat there terrified until finally we heard him open the door and leave. In the dark, we scrambled for the clothes that we could find and climbed out of the window and fled. 2 children, scared. No idea of how to survive, and at that moment, we did not know how to access legal protection. We didn't know how to access emergency shelter. We didn't know how to navigate systems intended to protect children experiencing abuse. It was late at night. The bus number 174 had stopped running, so we walked along Pacific Highway from about 208th Street to South Center, if you're familiar with that area. I eventually made my way to the Department of Social and Health Services. It was called DSHS back then. I went there because my birth mother had previously taken me there before, and I'd been placed in a foster home. It was a red brick building at the bottom of 23rd and Rainier in Seattle. It was after hours, the door was locked. I spoke to a woman through the intercom. I told her I did not have a place to go. The woman told me that technically I hadn't been abandoned yet, so there was nothing they could do. I ended up on a Metro bus. I headed to downtown Seattle. I knew that the route between downtown Seattle and South Federal Way was one of the longest bus rides I could take, so I rode that 174 back and forth. During the short few hours in the early morning when it didn't run, I would get off at the SeaTac airport and wait there until it resumed. I mean, who would know if I wasn't traveling? I remember well that on one of those long rides, I met a kind woman who would offer me shelter. So I went home with a total stranger. Now, this exposed me to other vulnerabilities, and that's a whole other discussion about youth and trafficking and increased vulnerabilities for some of our LGBTQIS plus communities, and particularly the youth. But I was lucky in many ways. The stranger that I went home with turned out to be a safe person, and so was her husband. They did as much for me as they could. Cheryl Blankenship. She offered me shelter in a small trailer that she shared with her husband. They were struggling themselves, trying to access systems and resources, landlord-tenant issues with unresolved maintenance requests for the trailer, the need for medical advocacy and Social Security benefits. Yet, there be no civil Gideon, no case that told them you are facing issues of such consequences to your right to life, liberty, and dignity that the law requires an attorney to assist you. I ended up leaving Cheryl's home because her husband became more ill and they could not take care of me anymore. I remember crying and asking her, what am I going to do now? She told me, just keep knocking. And just like I opened the door, someone else will too. Those words stayed with me. I'm thinking about those words right now in this very moment because that is what civil legal aid organizations do every day. You help open doors. Doors that systems have too often kept shut. Doors of safety, doors of housing, doors of protection, doors of justice. So I kept knocking. I eventually ended up at a youth home in Ballard. United Indians La Batea Youth Home was established in 1992 by founder Bernie Whitebear. May he rest in peace. Whitebear recognized that Native American youth were disproportionately represented in Seattle's homeless community, and he established La Batea, meaning the transformer. And he wanted to transform the situation of homeless youth so that they could be provided with transitional environments that allowed us to move from homelessness to permanent housing and self-sufficiency. So I stayed at La Batea, and that is ultimately where I met the lady that I would come to call my mommy, my greatest mentor, the late Julie Zarelli, or Miss Z, as everyone called her. By the way, I have 7 children. All 7 of them are named after Miss Z. Miss Z was a counselor at an alternative high school called Middle College, which used to be on the campus of Seattle Central Community College. She pieced together my transcripts and determined that with all the movements I had done as a homeless teen, I'd been to about 11 or 12 different schools between middle and high school. With her guidance, I graduated from high school and was accepted into the University of Washington. When I entered the University of Washington, I was still residing in a transitional living home for homeless teenagers. In fact, my problems had been compounded because I had become a pregnant teenager and was now in the middle of an abusive relationship. So I was again rendered homeless because I could not remain in the same shelter because it was not a shelter for pregnant or parenting teens. Eventually, I was able to enter a transitional living home organized by Friends of Youth. Homeless, pregnant, trying to escape a violent relationship, I had the challenge of navigating our complicated family law system, and I, like so many, could not afford an attorney. Speaking to the crisis of the lack of civil legal aid, the Washington Supreme Court commissioned an update of the 2003 Civil Legal Needs Study. It was published in 2015, and among its findings, people of color, survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, persons with disabilities, and young people between the ages of 15 to 21 experienced substantially greater rates of civil legal problems than their counterparts. The study also found that the top 5 problems for which low-income people most often seek help are tied to housing, family and domestic problems, financial challenges, and healthcare and disability-related issues. So this study reflects my own experience in the legal system. I was in an abusive relationship. I was trying to leave, and I had nowhere to go. I had no idea what rights I had. I didn't know how to navigate the custody arrangements, protection orders, parenting plans. And yet, there I was, by myself, trying to navigate the complicated family law court system as a pro se party as I sought a protective parenting plan and a domestic violence protection order. I knew when his hands were around my neck as we were holding our infant child that I had to leave. Yet I lacked access to meaningful legal guidance, and that matters because trauma is compounded when people are forced to navigate complicated legal systems alone. What ensued was a long and continuous proceeding, restraining orders, competing 191 arguments, parenting plans, contempt motions, repeated court appearances. The legal system itself felt impossible to understand. The forms were unintelligible. The wait for the hearings were often long, but my hearings felt rushed and quick. The courtroom space, cold and intimidating. I was a number on a full docket. At every step of the way, I felt disadvantaged because I did not have a lawyer and did not know how to navigate the legal system. Sometimes, I even felt ridiculed by the court for my ignorance of the process. In fact, it was how I was treated by our legal system that made me want to enter the legal profession and become a lawyer. The judges that I appeared before, hopefully none of you are in the room. Actually, hopefully you are. You were dispassionate and distant, detached and dismissive. Yet there be no civil Gideon, no case law that told me you are facing issues of such consequence to your right to life, liberty, and dignity that the law requires an attorney to assist you. I would eventually be assisted by an attorney who would charge me a sliding fee, but that was with me doing much of the drafting of the documents for her to review, and then she would appear at the hearing to argue. Can you imagine what that paperwork looked like? This is why civil legal aid matters. This is why access to civil legal aid matters. Organizations like the Eastside Legal Assistance Program stand in the gap for individuals and families who would otherwise face legal crisis alone. Organizations that provide civil legal aid, law firms that provide pro bono services, solo practitioners that perform pro bono legal work. Say that again, pro bono legal work. It's a word. Do you know that the people who need the services the most don't even know to call it pro bono legal work? We don't know what we're asking for. You help survivors secure protection. That's the work that you do. You help families facing eviction remain housed. You help parents protect their children. You help immigrants and seniors and workers and vulnerable community members understand their rights and access justice. Legal aid lawyers and legal navigators are often the first people who truly explain the system in human terms. And the plain language I wish our plain language forums actually had. When I practiced as a lawyer myself, I continued to witness how desperately these services were needed. But you are guiding people through some of the most frightening and vulnerable moments of their lives, helping people understand systems that were never designed to be easy, helping to ensure that access to justice is not reserved for only the privileged, reminding people that their stories matter. Now today, I've shared some very personal experiences with y'all. You're like, wow, she's a judge? Isn't it election time? She's telling people this? Absolutely. Absolutely. I do so because our experiences allow us to understand the material conditions and realities of those who come before us. I share those experiences because it allows us to have a deeper understanding of the people that we are working with. It allows for compassion and allows others to come from the shadows where they might languish and die. That is the work of the Eastside Legal Assistance Program. You help bring people from the shadows to stand in the center where they can be seen and heard. You are fighting to preserve the humanity of the families that you are standing with as they walk through financial debt crisis, healthcare and medical access issues, housing and eviction proceedings, immigration and employment matters, the procedural nightmare of veteran benefits, discrimination cases, domestic violence, and so much more. You are the armor that secures and protects the integrity of our legal system by working to ensure that a system is indeed a system to which we all have access, especially those who are vulnerable and those who are most in need. So you may not hear it as often as you should or in the moment that you should, particularly when you're working those long hours at your regular jobs and doing pro bono work. But I hope that you hear it loudly and clearly today. The work that each of you are doing, the work that you are supporting, it makes a difference. I am your proof it makes a difference. So many communities and families are vulnerable to the precarious nature of this system, but you are standing with them. You're advocating for them. You are the safekeepers of their humanity. You be the cultivators. You be the stewards. You be the precious guardians of their civil Gideon that is yet to be. Thank you.
Yes, please, let's show our deep appreciation for Judge Andrea Jarmon.